presentarle a todos nuestros seguidores del EcoExploratorio Museo de Ciencias de Puerto Rico. En nuestra edición virtual de hoy tenemos al doctor Peter Colarco de NASA Goddard. Él nos va a estar hablando sobre el GEOS, un modelo de predicción de aerosoles de la NASA y su aplicación al transporte de polvo del Sahara. Para que lo tengan en consideración, esta presentación será en inglés. Yo soy su moderadora del día de hoy, Maryland Brown. Les recuerdo que pueden dejar sus preguntas en la sección de Q&A si están en la aplicación de Zoom o si están en el Facebook Live en la sección de comentarios. Ahora les dejo con el doctor Peter Colarco. Dr. Peter, we are ready for you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to share my slides here, and if it doesn't work, we'll go back to you doing it. Let me just do that. And then let me know if you can see my slides now.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
With the share screen button? No, not yet.
Okay.
If it's easier, I could upload it on mine, and then you could tell me when to.
That's fine. We'll just do that then. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here and talk to your museum and its audience today. My name is Peter Colarco. I'm a scientist at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, which is right outside Washington, D.C. And I'm going to talk to you today about a model that we use called the GEOS model. And we use the NASA GEOS model for forecasting aerosols, such as the dust events that have recently impacted Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. I want to acknowledge I've had a number of contributions from my colleagues at NASA Goddard, as well as some other folks that are in the community. And I'll try to make those points as I go through the presentation. The next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So the outline for the talk, I'm going to hit on four major areas. Some of this is a bit introductory to the larger problems that I work on. So what are aerosols and how do they interact within the Earth system, which I'll get to in the next slides. And then I'm going to talk particularly about the role of mineral dust aerosols in the Earth system. I will then talk about how we go about modeling such particles in a weather kind of model. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with a little bit of insight into what we've done and seen with respect to the event that happened last month and was particularly dramatic where you folks are. So the next slide. So what are aerosols? So I'm talking about our tiny particles or liquid droplets that are suspended in the atmosphere. And the figure I've got at the top just illustrates what a few of these look like. And you can immediately see we're talking about a diverse collection of materials, from volcanic ash to biogenic materials like pollen particles, crystals like sea salt, and then very complicated fractal aggregates, very complicated fractal aggregate kinds of particles like soot, for example. And largely, we sort of classify these into two different types. Primary particles are things that are like dust from dust storms or wildfires, smoke from wildfires, sea spray, fossil fuel combustion. Other particles are secondary in nature, which means that they form due to chemical activity within the atmosphere. So the oxidation of sulfuric dioxide in the atmosphere that's emitted in fossil fuel combustion or from volcanic volcanic sources are typical examples of that. And I've just illustrated what some of these things look like sort of visually from the ground if you are observing them: dust storms and hazes, smoke and volcanic particles. Most of the aerosol emissions that happen by mass are natural. So think dust storms and sea salt particles. Those are large natural sources. But those particles tend to be fairly large and they have short atmospheric residence times. The remaining 10% or so of the aerosol mass is mainly anthropogenic in origin. It comes from our activities. These tend to be smaller particles, but they also tend to dominate the total number of particles that are in the atmosphere. The next slide. These are just some examples of how these particles in the atmosphere might be impacting us at sort of a human level. These are some dramatic examples from the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull that erupted in 2010. In the top left, this is an image from the MODIS spacecraft. This eruption shut down the air traffic ways between the United Kingdom, Europe, and North America for about a week after that happened. On the right, you see some examples from some recent forest fire activity that was happening in California. These kinds of events are becoming much more typical and are very dramatic with large property losses and loss of life as well. Of course, smog is another example. And then finally, here's a fairly dramatic example of a haboob front bringing a lot of dust across it. The next slide. So this is a little bit of why we care about this. And certainly from a human point of view, we care about these particles because they impact our air quality and human health. The chart that I've got in the top left is just showing two lines on it. And those lines add together to be sort of the total global population. And up through about 2010, the world population was about 7 billion people. And what we're looking at is that in the next 30 years or so, this is a bit outdated by now, but by 2050, the world's population is projected to be about 9 to 10 billion people. And if you look at those two lines, the lighter shaded one is showing the part of the population that is in rural communities. And that's essentially flat over time. So all the growth in population is occurring in urban areas. And we know that in urban areas, there's a high probability of encountering poor air quality events. And we see that in 2010, the total number of air quality related deaths was about 3.3 million people. It's projected to double in the next 25 or 30 years. And right now, we know that and presently, to update that from 2010, it's about 4 million air quality related deaths annually. It's the number 5 cause of premature mortality in people. Aerosol events, such as what I'm going to be talking about here, are implicated in a lot of those air quality episodes. And they're also a possible vector for bringing diseases and viruses and so on to human populations. The couple of maps that I'm showing here are also just showing sort of spatially where all the population happens to be and where mortality from air quality is especially severe. On the next slide, please. So in addition to the sort of direct human impacts of aerosol particles, I want to emphasize also that we care about them a great deal for their impacts within the Earth's climate system. And the types of interactions that we're talking about tend to be of several different classes. The first one is what we call aerosol radiation interactions. And that is you have some particles that are transported in the air, and they are between the surface and outer space. And those particles will interact with incoming solar radiation as well as outgoing radiation that just comes from the cooling of the Earth's surface. And generally, we tend to think about particles in one of two types. Are they reflective? That is, are they scattering particles? And so that's something like sulfur particles that are formed from the combustion of fossil fuels. And those tend to reflect solar radiation to space, and they tend to cool the Earth's surface. The other type are more absorbing particles, and those absorbing particles can actually absorb the incoming solar radiation and heat the atmosphere locally where that radiation is being absorbed. And that changes the thermodynamic structure of the atmosphere and affects the properties of clouds as well as the turbulence within the atmosphere. The next slide. Another class of these interactions would be aerosol cloud interactions. And that is where the particles that are present in the atmosphere are intersecting with the moisture and humidity that's in the atmosphere and affecting then the properties of the clouds. And if you look up at the sky and you see a cloud, those are tiny droplets of water that have condensed on aerosol particles. And the number and the kind of the aerosol particles that are up there tend to have some impact on what the clouds look like, as well as on their lifetimes and how likely they are to precipitate. So the general rule of thumb is that the more particles that you put into the atmosphere, the brighter the clouds tend to be, and that's because the cloud droplets within them tend to become a little bit smaller. So that affects how reflective clouds are to space, as well as whether those particles and whether the droplets in the clouds will efficiently coalesce and form rain droplets and precipitate to the Earth's surface. The next slide sort of combines these previous two Earth system interactions where you put the radiation and the clouds together. And this is what we call it's often called the semi-direct effect of aerosols. And it has to do with sort of the relationship between the heating that's caused by absorbing aerosols in the atmosphere, stabilizing the thermodynamic environment and making it a little bit less likely for clouds to form. The next slide, please. And finally, the way we sort of put all these pieces together is we look at the sum of these effects to understand a little bit the impacts of aerosols on the climate system as a whole. And so I talked about the aerosol radiation and cloud effects, and those are also often called the direct and indirect effect of aerosols. And the charts here are from, the top two charts are from the most recent of the IPCC climate assessment reports. And they highlight the main uncertainties we have in the radiative forcing of the Earth's climate system. The main point to take away from this is that there's a great deal of uncertainty that's around the radiative impacts of aerosols on the climate system. So things like greenhouse gases, which we know are driving the climate toward a warming, those are understood with a great deal more certainty than the impacts of aerosols. And this is because aerosols, as I've tried to impress, come from a variety of different sources and they have a variety of different properties. They're not very well characterized globally, and that tends to project into large uncertainties on the climate effects of aerosols. So the next slide will make that point a little bit more visually clear, where I just point out that aerosols are very complex and their interactions with the system are diverse because of that complexity. These are just some examples here. So I imagine the slides will be available and can be viewed later on to see some of these details. Okay, the next slide, please. So what I really want to talk about now then is the particular impact of mineral dust aerosols on the Earth system. And you know, as I noted earlier, mineral dust are of a class of particles that are natural in their origin. They tend to be the most abundant aerosol by mass that remains suspended in the atmosphere. I've got a very dramatic picture here. The Earth is a little bit sideways in this picture. At the bottom of it, you can see the West African coast. The Sahara Desert is the largest source of dust particles on the planet. And you can see a dramatic plume of dust that's leaving West Africa, going over the Cape Verde Islands and approaching the Caribbean. South America is right at the top of that map there. So dust like this is pretty much the most visible aerosol feature from space. And I want to stress, you know, every year there's a tremendous quantity of this material that is transported from Africa and toward the Americas and into the Caribbean. It's enough material to fill the Empire State Building in New York about 15 times over. The next slide, please. So I talked briefly a few moments ago about the Earth system interactions of aerosol particles. This is a graphic that sort of projects all of those together in a somewhat different way. So we know that during a week-long trip from Africa over to the Caribbean and the Americas, a journey of thousands of kilometers, that dust particles are interacting with a whole different set of activities within the Earth system. So on the right side of this chart over Africa, we have the emission process, which is where the source of the particles are. They tend to get lifted very high into the atmosphere to altitudes of 3 or 4 or 5 kilometers, and they're transported off of Africa and out over the North Atlantic Ocean, they have those radiation interactions that I described earlier. And two, as the particles interact with clouds and humidity fields, they also will change the properties of clouds. The main sources by which dust is removed from the atmosphere are in part due to gravitational settling, which is just that the particles are large and they're heavy and they tend to fall out, but also through the interactions with clouds where the particles will coalesce with rain droplets and can be removed by precipitation and deposited to the surface. This interaction between the gravitational settling and the interactions with clouds tends to redistribute these particles in altitude in the atmosphere. Some of this material that's brought down to the surface has the potential to interact with biogeochemical cycles in the ocean. That is, the minerals that are in dust particles can fertilize phytoplankton activity in oceanic basins. And also when that material is deposited over land, it can also act as a fertilizer and a nutrient in terrestrial ecosystems. Think like in the Amazon rainforest, for example. And then finally, as this dust makes its journey all the way across to the Americas and it's descending gradually in altitude, you have the potential for these air quality and visibility events like I talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So here what I'm trying to show using some data from a paper by a scientist named Paul Junot is using some satellite observations from a sensor called MODIS that NASA has flying in space. You can observe the amount of dust over certain regions. And this is a particular analysis that was done to really emphasize where dust is emitted over the global dust source regions. And so the colors on these charts are showing more or less the intensity, the amount of dust that's in the atmosphere over these regions. And by zooming in on these locations, what you can see is where dust is very likely to be emitted from, which is unsurprisingly from a region around the world called the Dust Belt, which tends to be sort of desert or bare soils that are more easily eroded by the wind processes. And one of the things that I liked about this figure and why I wanted to show it here is to emphasize that as you go from the top to the bottom, you're sort of marching through the seasons of the year. And you can see that dust, where dust is prominent, changes throughout the year. That is, the different dust source regions become active at different times of the year, with especially the Asian sources in the deserts in China becoming active in the Northern Hemisphere springtime. And then most dramatically and most notably, the Saharan sources becoming really the dominant source as you go into the summertime in June, July, and August. So this distinct seasonal variability in the activity of Saharan dust sources plays out in where dust is transported to. And so if you go to the next slide, I show an example of this. So this is a figure that's composed from data from the model that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. This is our GEOS model. And what we've done is we've synthesized that model with satellite observations, and we've made here a frequency diagram, and it just shows where the dust is most likely to be concentrated in a couple of different months out of the year to illustrate that seasonal variability in where dust is emitted over its source regions also plays out in where dust is transported to. And so the common pathways that we see are in the late winter and early spring. We tend to have African dust transport going more toward the northern part of South America, and especially over Barbados, for example. But in the summertime, in July, the transport tends to move further to the north, and you have the potential for a lot of dust to be going over the northern part of the Caribbean and even into the US Gulf Coast states and Mexico and so on. The next slide. And it's not just where in latitude and longitude the dust gets transported, but also where vertically it gets transported. These figures are on the right side, you're marching from the West African coast through the Eastern Caribbean, and then on the left side into the Western Caribbean. And there's several sets of lines on these figures, But the blue colored lines are that March time frame, which is that wintertime time frame. And if you look over on the right toward the West African coast, the blue lines that you'll see there, one is from our model and one is from a satellite instrument, which is called CATS, which is a LiDAR that sees the vertical profile of aerosols. You can see that in the wintertime, the dust tends to be more concentrated at lower altitudes. It tends to be emitted from the African coast below 2 or 3 kilometers in altitude. Whereas in the summertime, which is the orange colors, the emissions of dust tend to occur at higher altitudes. And that affects how far the dust is transported from its source areas. The next slide, please. And when you put these things together, that seasonal distribution of where dust is emitted from over Africa, as well as the vertical distribution at which it gets transported, you can see how that actually plays out at a couple of ground sites here. So one is Cayenne in French Guiana on the northeast coast of South America, and the other is Guadeloupe in the Caribbean islands. And these two sites are shown there, and you can see the blue and the red colors. The blue is the Guadeloupe site and the red is the Cayenne site. And in the line chart that's at the bottom, what you can see are measurements of the surface concentration of what's called PM10, particulate matter that's of a certain size. These are large particles and they tend to be dominated by dust. And you can see the distinct seasonality of the dust concentrations at these two locations. Where at Cayenne, which is the red line, the peak in the dust concentrations comes a little bit earlier in the year, in that January, February, March kind of time frame, that winter time frame like I showed earlier. Whereas at Guadeloupe, which is a little bit further to the north, the peak in the dust concentrations tends to come a little bit later in the year, during the summertime. There's another line that's on this chart, which is at the level of 50 micrograms per cubic meter, which is one of the threshold lines, the WMO recommended 24-hour maximum exposure to such large particles, to PM10 concentrations. And that number, you can see, is very frequently exceeded during dust events, such as the one I'm going to talk about later in the talk. Next slide, please. And then finally, these differences in how the dust is transported, as well as a lot of uncertainties that we have about the properties of dust, they tend to play out in our uncertainties in assessing the climate forcing. This is a bar chart that's from a paper by a colleague of mine, Jasper Koch. We've adapted this figure here just to illustrate that there are the total radiative effect expected for dust particles in the atmosphere. So if you remember, I mentioned that when you put aerosols into the atmosphere, they tend to cool the Earth's surface because they reflect sunlight back into space. And that's the part of the bar chart that is called the shortwave part of the bar chart. And we tend to see the negative numbers indicate that that's a cooling of the Earth system. The chart in the middle there is the long wave, and that has to do with the fact that the large dust particles also interact with the heat radiation that comes from the surface of the Earth. So that's the long wave part, and that tends to trap radiation and tends to warm the Earth. When you add these two things together, you get the net effect of all of that radiation interactions. And that's those purple bars on the right side. And so the net effect is that dust is likely to be a cooling influence. But now I want to draw attention to the fact that there's two different bars in each of these. And one of these is the bar that comes from climate models, such as the one I'm going to talk about, which are these model-derived estimates. And those models tend to say that the dust has a very strong cooling effect on the Earth's surface. On the other hand, when you bring in the observations that you have to bear, you have the lighter purple bar on the right, which has a line around it that says we have a lot of uncertainty, and to some extent that dust may actually be net warming the climate system. That uncertainty is important. We want to try to resolve that uncertainty by bringing the models and the observations together and trying to resolve some of what we don't know about dust properties that are in the models. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so finally, this is just then the overall motivation, maybe more my motivation for what I try to do as a scientist, is that in order to understand the impacts of dust and other aerosols in the atmosphere, the way I work on this problem is I work with models. We try to build models that represent their processes and distributions within the Earth system. I'm going to talk now in the next slides, and kind of move on. I'm going to talk specifically about a model that I work with called GEOS, which is an Earth system model. We run GEOS at a variety of resolutions and scales. Now you'll see here, there's an if you click on this, there should be a nice animation that plays. And I have no idea how well this really works across the internet like this. But this is an example of a simulation that we do with our GEOS model. GEOS is a global Earth system model. The different colors on here are really highlighting a few different types of aerosols that we simulate. Those yellowish and orangish colors are the dust. And then we've got blue, which is a sea spray aerosol, which is emitted over the ocean surfaces. And you can see these whiter colors, they're not clouds, they tend to be associated with anthropogenic pollution that comes from either wildfire emissions or power plant emissions. So the next slide, please. So what we do with our model, so our model again is called GEOS, that's the Goddard Earth Observing System model. What we do with GEOS is it's a weather model. You can think of it just like the same kind of weather models that are used to forecast meteorology and the local precipitation and whether it's a good day for a picnic if you're allowed outside anymore. But you know, it's a weather model that has another piece added to it, which is this representation of these aerosol particles. And in the GEOS model, we put emissions in there for all different classes of aerosols. We're going to talk about dust a little bit. But we do sea salt, we do volcanic emissions, we do anthropogenic. Biomass burning is an incredibly important one with the seasonal wildfire activity that happens in especially the US West Coast every year. We tend to put the processes for the models in. So in addition to the emission processes, we think about the things that are sinks, that is the things that remove them from the atmosphere, the settling and dry deposition of particles to the surface, as well as their washout by clouds. And then we try to put in these other processes that I talked about earlier, the aerosol radiation and aerosol cloud processes. And finally, the chemistry of these particles. And all of these interactions then feed back on what the model wants to predict for the weather, the winds and the temperature, the occurrence and frequency and intensity of clouds and precipitation, and so on. So this is sort of a very high level introduction to what we do with the GEOS model. The next slide, please. So this gets a little bit more into specifically how we deal with dust aerosols in the GEOS model. So every one of these different compositional components in the model you know, has its own physics and treatment to it. So I'll talk particularly here about what we do with dust. So we understand that the mobilization process, that is the process that emits dust from the Earth's surface and puts it into the atmosphere, is a complicated process that depends on a lot of the details of the surface properties themselves. And we tend to talk about sort of the physical mechanisms or physical schemes to describe that process. And this cartoon is illustrating what we think is sort of the main process for this, which is called saltation and sandblasting. And the combination of those two processes, what they are is that saltation is when the winds go across the surface of an erodible area. They tend to pick up not the largest particles that are on the surface, which could be things like rocks and vegetation, and not the tiniest particles, but they tend to pick up some intermediate sized particles. And these sort of bounce along the Earth's surface. And in that bouncing motion, when they bounce, they break apart, they fragment, or they break apart the soil particles at the surface and they fragment. And it's those tiny fragments that are emitted in that's the sandblasting process. Those tiny fragments then get lifted into the air and they become the vertical flux of emissions into the atmosphere. And they tend to be the smaller particles that can live longer in the atmosphere and then be transported over long distances. The next slide. So the details of this process can be very complex. the challenge to representing a process like this in a computational model like the one we have is that it would require a great deal of information about what's happening at the surface. And that includes things like knowing how the soil varies from one place to another place, knowing about the distributions of vegetation and rocks and dead trees and debris and buildings and so on. All of those distributions of those things which tend to impede the capability of the surface to be emitting dust. And then also you need to have your model have very high quality winds represented in it and what we call boundary layer processes or boundary layer mechanics, which is the representation of the turbulence and the structure of the lowest part of the atmosphere. So even if we had all that information, and we can, and we do try to work on very physically based schemes like this, it's not always the case that it works very well in a global model. It's a tremendous amount of work to get something like this to really work well. And sometimes it works well in one part of the earth and less well in another part of the earth. And that has a lot to do with the quality of your model in a more general sense than it is about your understanding of the physical process. So what the next slide is going to show is that we've tried to compensate for this with something that's a more intermediate complexity scheme. And it tends to work really, really well. And this is some more work from my colleague, Paul Junot, and it represents the scheme that we more or less have in our model right now. And that is that Paul Junot and Joe Prospero were working together in the early 2000s, and they made this association between some of the satellite observations that were coming available at that time, which was that you tended to see the dust producing regions of the earth were associated also with large topographic depressions. That is, places where the topography was low. And these areas they found were associated with, typically with ancient hydrological basins, places where rivers used to run, or where there were inland lakes and so on. And these ancient hydrological basins had been places where erodible sediments had accumulated over time. And so Paul put together a scheme that we're still using in our model today, which is using these topographical source functions to describe how likely a certain area on the earth is to be an efficient source of emitting dust particles. Now this source function that I'm talking about, which is what this map is showing, that's only one part of the problem, because the winds is the other part of the problem that you really need to consider. But when you just look at this map, again, you can see predictably that a lot of the action for these dust emitting regions is across Northern Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, across the Dust Belt, across Asia as well. And you can see other parts of the earth as well. It's a little bit hard to see in this image because the scale is such, but there are dust emitting regions in North America, in sort of the US Southwest, as well as in Patagonia in South America, and then too in Southern Africa and Australia as well. But the main sources that we see when we look at the dust emitting regions from this perspective are across Northern Africa. That big orange spot in the middle of Northern Africa is what's called the Beaudelet Depression, which is around Lake Chad. The next slide, please. So having a map like the previous one, that tells us where dust is likely to be emitted from. But you need to merge a map like that also with your representation of the winds that are blowing across the surface, because ultimately it's the stress of the wind on the Earth's surface that's emitting the dust. And so I've written an equation here. I probably shouldn't have done that, but I've written an equation here. It's a fairly simple equation, but it shows you that the amount of dust that gets emitted, which is this F, that's the flux of dust that we emit, is related to the winds, which is that U. And what I've shown here graphically on the left is that the emissions, it depends on what time of year you're talking about, where they're coming from. So in the top plot there, you can see again, the bright spot there over Central Africa is that Beaudelet Depression, which tends to be very active in the MAM is the March, April, May season of the year. And then the bottom plot is showing June, July, and August, which is the summertime. And you can see that although that Beaudelet Depression area is still a fairly active source, a lot of other areas become much more excited sources in the model. And those include the Western African coast sources and some North African sources, as well as the activity in other parts of the world there, like in Saudi Arabia, for example. The next slide, please. So that's more or less a description of how we put the emissions of dust into our model and how it is interacting with the meteorology in the model. It's those surface winds that are lifting the dust here. So for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through just a little bit about our near real-time forecasting system that we have and how it represents this most recent massive dust event that's impacted the region. So again, this is our GEOS model. It's run at NASA Goddard in a forecasting system, just like any other weather model. We run this at what's a fairly high resolution for a global model, which is grid boxes that are about 12 kilometers in size. And with this system, we produce forecasts of meteorology and aerosols 4 times a day. These meteorological forecasts are being used by my colleagues at the University of Puerto Rico right now to support the Calaima public health campaign that's going on over the summer months. We're really happy to have these products being used by researchers such as them, as well as other colleagues around the world are using these products to help guide other observation experiments that are going on around the world. And the panel on the right just shows an example of what our forecasting website looks like and gives you sort of an inkling of what it looks like when we actually simulate, an instant in time from a dust point of view. I'm going to show you more figures like this in just a moment here. The one other thing I want to say before I move on is I've focused most of this so far on sort of the physical processes that are in the model. And, fully acknowledging that, just like how a weather forecast is never perfect, we have other imperfections in the model too that relate not just to the weather forecast itself, but also to what we don't know about aerosol properties and processes. And so we use a system called data assimilation, where we fuse observations, usually from satellites, sometimes also from ground sensors. And we fuse that information together with what we think the model is projecting, and we use that to correct the model. So a lot of what I'm going to show you is forecast, but also forecast that's informed by this data assimilation. And in our particular model, the quantity that we're fusing in the model is what's called the aerosol optical depth, which is just a measure of how much stuff is over your head. And we're getting data for that that's going into the model from 2 different systems. One is called MODIS, which is a satellite-based system, and the other is AeroNet, which is a ground-based set of sensors. And the fusion of those data with our model forecast is ultimately what the product is that we're looking at in the remainder of this talk. Okay, the next slide, please. So I'm going to finish up by just walking through this case study from June 2020. This event is not even a month old yet, and I confess that I was bogged down with proposal writing and things like that. So I'm still learning about the event, and we really want to put it together and sort of tell the story about this event. So what I have right now is just sort of a very preliminary look at what this event looked like. The figure that I'm showing you here, this is data from that MODIS satellite sensor I mentioned earlier. Now this is really just sort of a snapshot from its camera. And you can get to this from the Worldview, the NASA Worldview data site. And you can navigate a system like this and make these kind of pictures for yourself to look at these events. This is a snapshot on June 22nd, which is right about when the peak of the dust loading over the Caribbean was observed to be. And you can see that pall of dust that's there stretching over Puerto Rico and the other Caribbean islands, really densely there in that image right there. And the next slide shows what it looks like a few days later, when you can see that that dust is propagated all the way into the US Gulf and over the Yucatan Peninsula and to Texas, where you can see it's also interacting with some weather systems that's right there. So this is the event that we're talking about, is this June 20th to 25th kind of time frame. The next slide. Now, I mean, and this is a truly extraordinary event because this is some data that's shown from the US EPA Air Now website, and it's showing, this is June 26th, so just a day later than that last satellite image I showed you. But you can see here very dramatically the poor air quality conditions along the US Gulf Coast. Those red and orange areas across the Texas coast are really extraordinary high particulate matter concentrations. This happens from time to time where you do get these Saharan dust intrusions, but I think that we're going to see that this was a truly extraordinary event. And I'm going to show you some data that hints that that's probably the case in a few slides here. So the next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the Kalima pH campaign that's going on right now, and there's a network. This network of ground-based monitoring sites around the Caribbean region that are measuring particulate matter at the surface. And as part of their effort, I've been contributing the GEOS 5 aerosol forecasts. Now, this figure is not from our aerosol forecast. This is from some of that AeroNet data that I mentioned earlier. This is a ground-based system that's measuring that optical depth, that column amount of material over your head. And the point that I wanted to make is it was a little bit depressing at the beginning of June because the concentrations of dust in this time period were actually quite low. They're not zero. An optical depth of 0.5, which is roughly what that early part in Barbados is looking like in the early part of June, you know, that's a fairly beefy aerosol signal. In Cape San Juan in Puerto Rico, it's lower even than that. And so this was kind of you know, good for the local air quality, but if you're out there and you're interested in measuring dust, it was not the most exciting thing. But the next slide, please. So the next slide is highlighting, this is the event we're talking about here, where the aerosol loading over these sites increases by a factor of 3 or 4 or even more than that. And this is really not so boring now. It's a highly unusual to get this kind of loading. And I know kind of anecdotally that for some of these sites, these were the highest concentrations of aerosols that have ever been measured in the records that have been taken there. So the next slide, please. Okay, so this is to bring it back to me, the modeler. And I'm referring back to our GEOS 5 system again here. And you can see that, so what I'm showing you in this chart is a forecast of that dust optical depth at Cape San Juan. And on the left-hand chart, you can see that we've got that low dust optical depth forecast through the mid part of June, but our forecasting system runs for 10 days. So this is from a forecast that started on June 12th. And even on June 12th, we were predicting something was going to happen a little bit later on. We weren't sure quite what, but it looked like there was a dust event happening. And the animation, which I don't know how well that's playing, the animation is sort of hinting that we can see dust building up over Africa and then a large pulse of it that comes across the Caribbean, across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean. And that's that event right there. So the next slide, please. So what happens is we run our forecasting system. We actually run it 4 times a day, but here what I've done is I've picked one of the forecasts from each day. And as you march across the month, the colors of these lines are changing. They go from dark for the June 12th forecast toward lighter colors that are where the forecast is being started a little bit closer and closer and closer to this event that peaks on June 22nd. So for each of these, we're making a 10-day forecast. And what you can see on that previous slide, the peak in the dust AOD was only up to about 0.5 or so. But you can see that the forecast is changing as you get closer and closer to this event. And what's happening is a combination of things. The certainty you have in the weather forecast is getting better the closer you are to the time that you're interested in. That is probably makes sense for anybody who's looked at the long-term outlook from their weather forecast on TV. The closer you get to the event, the more certainty you have about what it's going to be like. But then another thing is happening too, which is that data assimilation that I mentioned earlier is kicking in. And so we're simulating the dust in our model, but we're also fusing it with satellite observations that are helping to correct errors and uncertainties we have in the dust distributions. And so you can see that as you get closer and closer to this event and the colors of these lines get lighter, the event is really changing its character, so that when you get very close to when the event actually took place, the forecast for the dust AOD is not that weak, sort of anemic 0.5 AOD, it's peaked way above 1.5 even. So that's sort of the benefit of looking at the forecast as you get closer. So the next slide, please. This is now what the whole month of June looks like from our system after we've sort of gone back and reprocessed all of the observations. And this is what's called our analysis. So we make these forecasts, but we also just kind of keep the model up to date with real time as it marches along. And you can see as the animation plays that we're showing that progress of this event across the whole Atlantic and into the US East Coast. The little inset figure there is some more of that data from those AeroNet sites. And again, you know, we get this massive peak in the optical depth. The blue triangle is over close to Africa, is showing the data that's coming out of the Cape Verde Islands. And then the other one is Cape San Juan, which is that redder triangle. And then finally in Tallahassee, Florida is the green triangle. You can see the progress of that event where that dust kind of wraps around and comes back over Florida before it exits over the northern Atlantic. Of course, as it's being transported, it's also being washed out. And that's ultimately the fate of that dust, is to get washed out by rainfall. The next slide, please. I'm just about at the end of the presentation here. So we're not the only model in town that does this kind of work. In the top left is the forecast, is our June 22nd forecast from the GEOS model. But I want to emphasize, I work within a large community of teams around the world that are simulating events like this with global models. And we have a group called ICAP, that's down there at the bottom of the chart, that I'm a co-lead with. And the ICAP group really tries to bring together and synthesize the modeling expertise from a number of meteorological centers around the world. And I've highlighted a number of modeling groups around the world that contribute near real-time forecasts to their respective communities for events like this. And you can see when you just sort of visually look at this, that all of these models have some representation of this event that's happening. The colors indicate that optical depth again, that amount of material. And you can see that they differ quite a bit in how much dust they think is in the Caribbean, for example, for the same time. So that's an interesting thing that ultimately we want to get together. All of these models have some physical representation of dust like ours does. Many of these models are also doing this data assimilation as well. And so somewhere in there, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the data and the processes. And it leads to that uncertainty that we have in the ultimate forecast from any one system. What we actually try to do is put these together, and we come up with what we call a multi-model ensemble. And that's shown on the next slide here. And what this is this is the ICAP multi-model ensemble, and it shows the mean. So that's kind of averaging all of those models together. And the top panel is at Cape San Juan is the ICAP multi-model ensemble dust optical depth over the 10 years that we've been doing ICAP, since about 2011. And you can see that seasonal peak there in the summertime. That's the typical pattern of dust that comes into the Caribbean in the summertime. And then all the way on the right side of that black line, it's a little bit hard to see, but that black line goes all the way up to the top of that chart. How about that? So that's an event that really stands out. And that's made a little bit more explicit on the chart right below that, which is showing all of those different years for the March through August summertime time, the May through August summertime time period, all of those different years. And then the black line, which of course doesn't go all the way through August yet, is the 2020 line. But you can see that peak on June 22nd that just really stands out there. And when you look at all the data, this is my colleague Peng Zhan at the Navy Research Lab in Monterey put this together. When you look at all that data, this event stands out as being about 4.5 times the magnitude of the 90 percentile, which means it's 4.5 times more intense than most of the intense events that are observed in the whole time series. So that's really extraordinary. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so this is now a little bit of, well, what made this event extraordinary? Why did this happen? And again, I want to emphasize, you know, this is a preliminary sort of analysis. And I think what we're going to see, and this is a hypothesis I state right here, is that we had a persistent weather system that was just parked off the west coast of North Africa. And that high pressure system sat there. And what it allowed to happen was dust emissions just occurring over Saharan Africa, just sort of piled up there. And I try to show that kind of graphically here with a chart from our model, where the black line on that chart is the dust emissions, which you can see they're relatively constant in time. So it's not so much the case that I would suggest that there was an explosive dust emission event. It's rather more the case that when you look at the red line, that's the accumulated amount of material, and it was just sort of building up over there. And then finally, that weather system moved off, and you get this dramatic decrease in the dust loading over Africa. And that's because all that material is now moved out into the Atlantic, and that's your event right here. Another thing that I think really played into this too is that when you have these dust particles in such quantities in the atmosphere, remember those Earth system interactions, they're interacting with the radiation. It tends to warm the atmosphere in the layer that dust is at. And that warming of that layer tends to suppress the conditions that would allow a lot of clouds to form. And so when you look at that satellite picture at the bottom right there, you can see that where that dust is sitting there, there isn't a lot of cloud right under it. And so I think that the dust amount was so large that it was probably suppressing the rainfall that would have otherwise been washing that material out. So it tended to last longer in that sense. I think my next slide is just my conclusions, and I would stop the talk right at that point. So, you know, I hope that I've told you a little bit about aerosol particles and their complexity and diversity. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they interact in the Earth system and human environments in many complicated ways. We try to develop models of these things to represent the transport and the distributions of these particles and how they interact with weather systems. You know, at the end of this, I'm really interested in trying to understand more about this extraordinary June 2020 event that's impacted the region and the US Gulf Coast states. And you know, I want to emphasize too that you know, my model is just one of the models that's going to be applied to studying this event. And when we looked at the range of the ICAP models, you can see that although they all did a pretty good job with the pattern of the transport, they had significant differences in the amounts of dust. And that's a really interesting thing to try to understand what's going on, why was that the case in one model versus another, and use that to try to improve our overall ability to forecast events like this over this region. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. That was very interesting and informative. We do have several questions. So I'm going to go with the first one. They ask, how do you measure how much dust travels yearly to the Caribbean and South America? Great.
So the measurement of that, you know, ideally you'd be flying airplanes everywhere all the time to measure things like that. Well, we can't do that. So we rely on satellite observations. And there are a number of different kinds of satellites that are in space. I mentioned the MODIS sensor for one, which you can think of as a camera looking down at the Earth. And I showed you some of those camera pictures that it takes. But the observations that it makes are done with a great deal of precision, which actually allow you to sort of estimate the total amount of dust that's in the picture. And so what you do when we make these estimates of the total amount of this is you look at a whole time series of these satellite observations and you piece them together and you come up with an estimate then of the total amount of dust.
Thank you. We have the next question. Is the Saharan dust similar to the dust storms that can be seen in Arizona?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. And I confess right up here that I don't know as much about the particulars of the dust emission process in the Southwest United States. but you know, I would emphasize it has a lot to do with what the different weather patterns are in these different regions. So in the Sahara, we tend to get a lot of dust that comes with the passage of frontal systems. And you may be familiar with frontal systems, as that's what changes the weather where you are locally when a front passes. And these frontal systems, which are also called haboobs, can sweep across the entire African continent, and they can just drive a massive production event right there. But there are other processes that are also occurring there, and they have to do with thunderstorm activity. And when you have a thunderstorm, you can have these tremendous downdrafts of winds that tends to lift dust off the Earth's surface as well. And then, and I think, especially in a place like the Southwest United States, you can get a certain contribution of dust also coming from more localized meteorological phenomena like dust devils, which are tornado-like kind of vortices. So I think the process is very similar across these locations, but the specific meteorological processes might be a little bit different.
Thank you. They also asked, what is an aerosol?
What is an aerosol?
Yes.
Yes. So an aerosol is a particle or a droplet that remains suspended in the atmosphere. So dust is one kind of aerosol. So these are particles. You know, I'm tending to talk about things that can live in the atmosphere for you know, days at a time. They're small enough that they don't fall out immediately, and so they can live for long-range transport. So dust is a solid particle type of aerosol, and a more liquid type of aerosol particle would be these sulfate particles that come from the oxidation of chemicals in the atmosphere, and they make these droplets.
Thank you. They also asked, during the different studies performed, did you notice any significant relationship in the dust accumulation between the hottest years?
Oh, okay. So I didn't really get into looking at one year to the next so much for this analysis. So I can't really answer that question with a great deal of precision. I know that, well, first of all, I should say, you know, I spend a lot of time talking about how we try to do the dust emission process in a model like ours. And there's a challenge to that, which is that we don't actually have global observations of dust emissions exactly. The best thing that we can say is we can make an estimate of how much dust is in the atmosphere. So that's probably correlated with the dust emissions. I think that it tends to be the case that there's not a whole lot of variability from one year to the next over the emitting regions in the Sahara. I would say, except maybe on longer timescales when you start to have more impacts from from sort of decadal trends in how dry the soil is. There tends to be a period in the 1980s, for example, when there was quite a bit more dust produced over that region, which had, I think, to do with the presence of drought over that region. It's a normally dry area, but it was more enhanced drought in the 1980s, let's say, than it is even today right now.
Okay. And someone else asked, is there any other hypothesis to explain why we had that massive dust storm?
So I think the other thing that I've heard, and I'm not sure that it's really contradictory to what I suggested in my slide there, but I think the other thing that I've heard is the winds that carry the dust. So the dust is emitted over Africa and it goes to fairly high altitudes, and then it tends to move out in pulses from Africa in relation to a weather phenomenon called the African Easterly Jet. And that jet is like the jet stream across North America, is a river of wind that is then carrying these particles with it. And so the intensity of those winds might vary from one year to another year. So the other hypothesis I've heard is that the jet was a little bit weaker and then suddenly picked back up again. And all of these weather phenomena are interconnected with each other. So that may be the case that the jet was a little bit weaker at the same time as we had that system that was trapping the dust being emitted over Africa, and that they sort of broke out together.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Someone asked, he asked, can dust from the Sahara travel until it passes through the atmosphere?
Travel until it passes through the atmosphere?
Yeah.
So these are particles that, there's another kind of instrument, which I didn't get into here, which is called a LiDAR. And a LiDAR is, there's one flying in space right now, which is called Calypso. It's a laser beam that looks down from space, and it reflects off of particles in the atmosphere. And when you look at dust plumes like these coming off of Africa, we tend to see the top of those dust plumes at altitudes of about 5 kilometers or so. So there's not really a lot of evidence that large amounts of dust get much higher than that. Sometimes you can pump dust up to higher altitudes if it gets trapped in a thunderstorm complex, where it can be lifted to maybe 10 or 12 kilometers over the subtropical areas. But there's not really a lot of evidence that dust from the Earth's surface gets transported to much higher altitudes than that ever. And so it doesn't escape into space, if that's sort of what the question is. So.
Okay, thank you. And so the last question is it expected that we'll see the same behavior in the future as we've seen this year?
Great question. Boy, I don't know the answer. As you saw from that slide I showed you from the ICAP ensemble, over a 10-year period of time, it looked pretty much the same from one year to the next year to the next year, but then this one really stands out as pretty extraordinary. So I don't know if this is the beginning of something that's, would persist from one year to the next. I think it was a particularly unique weather situation that's set up. Certainly it could happen again. It's happened once, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what I would say about what it would look like next year.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peter, for all your great answers and this great talk. So any other questions, they could send questions to our email, and then we'll be happy to forward it to you.
That's great. That's wonderful.
Our email is info@ecoexploratorio.org. Y bueno, gracias a todos por participar, y queremos entonces agradecer a todos nuestros auspiciadores por hacer esto posible. Tenemos Amgen, First Bank, Goya, Cooper Vision, el Donativo Legislativo, el NASA Space Grant Consortium, NASA Partners, WAPA, WKQ y Selectos.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the chance to talk.
Charlas especiales, científicos en línea. So, estén pendientes entonces a nuestros servicios en línea. Si están interesados en uno de ellos, pueden llamarnos al 787-281-9090. También tenemos un concurso para los niños entre 9 a 17 años. El concurso se llama Crea tu invento. Es para conservar nuestra agua. Tenemos entonces hasta el 23 de julio para poder registrarte y participar. También tenemos, como pueden ver aquí, ventas de mascarillas en telas. Tenemos diferentes patrones de la mascarilla. Están a $10 con el IVA incluido. También por favor llamar para verificar entonces qué patrones quedan disponibles. El 787-281-9090. Tenemos del océano, del delfines, de tortuga, de planeta, de cohetes. So, pueden llamar para adquirir tu mascarilla. Luego también, si usted desea contribuir con la educación y con facilitar todas estas actividades y webinars, pueden hacer un donativo por ATH móvil en la sección de Business, bajo EcoExploratorio. Y recuerda escribir el mensaje Ciencia Virtual. Y recuerda, si estás interesado en cualquier otra información o nuestros calendarios de la semana que viene, dale like a nuestra página de Facebook, Instagram, Twitter y también en la página de YouTube para poder ver los próximos, los pasados webinars. También pueden llamarnos al 787-281-9090. Si tienen cualquier duda o pregunta, también puedes escribirnos al correo electrónico webinar@ecoexploratorio.org y visitarnos en nuestra página ecoexploratorio.org/ciencia virtual. Gracias por estar conectados y cuídense mucho. Nos vemos en la próxima.